Welcome to Coffee with Coker, a healthcare business podcast published by the Coker Group. My name is Mark Reibolt, and I'm your host. Just real quick, Coker Group, we're a national healthcare consulting firm. We work with hospitals, health systems, medical practices throughout the U.S. We've done it for over 30 years, and we focus on helping our clients navigate the changes and challenges of the evolving healthcare industry. So we are excited to welcome you all to episode 3 of the Coffee with Coker podcast. Today, we have another guest with us, Jeff Gorke. We're going to jump right in here, but really the idea for today's conversation, similar if you listen to our episode 2 with Dr. Mac Knight, is we really want to tee up some different topics and subjects that are related to practice management, but really kind of stem from a lot of the things we do in this area and a lot of the feedback we've gotten from clients. So overall, we're going to talk about operational issues in the medical practices and physician services realm. But really, I just want Jeff to go through some of the things he does and talk about some of the ways that we've been able to work with and help clients through various ventures and challenges and overcoming obstacles and all that good stuff. So, Jeff, I tell you what, why don't we, by the way, welcome.
Thank you.
And why don't we just start off, just tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about your background, and then kind of lead into what you do, what your primary area of focus is in working with clients.
Okay. Thank you for the intro, and I'm delighted to be here. I have been in the healthcare space for almost 30 years. And have a fairly wide-ranging background relative to healthcare. I cut my teeth in Medicare administration for a Part B carrier. It was the Travelers Insurance Company at the time. And after getting my master's degree, I decided to get out and try to run a medical practice. And started, as most administrators do, with a small practice with a couple locations. It was an ophthalmology practice in Virginia and had 2 doctors at the time and 4 locations, and just kind of grew from there. Most of my career has been spent running private medical practices. Going into some of our engagements or discussing items or issues with clients, I bring the background of having actually run a medical practice, rolled up my sleeves and done pretty much everything from check in to check out. Put my first EMR in 2002, which went fairly well. I always say that EMR implementations, even when they're 100% perfect, are usually only about 80%. But that went better than expected. And so I've got the bruises and the war wounds to show from having lived in the trenches in medical practices. And I have been working on the management consulting / advisory side of the ledger for about 10 years now.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I would say, without a doubt, within the healthcare services sector, if you look at it that way, nothing has changed more than kind of the dynamics and operational structure behind the medical practice, whether it's size, scope, scale. They've changed multiple times since I've been in the industry for the last 15 years, I'm sure for you beyond that. So it seems like there's kind of a constant changing or continuously evolving dynamic there as it relates to medical practices. So there's, never a shortage of things to deal with, whether it's EMR implementations or, rev cycle issues or personnel or whatever. So that's helpful. So I also want to just let everyone know we're going to talk about a number of things. So we're going to bounce around a little bit as it relates to subjects today. But the idea, again, similar to what we did with Dr. Knight, is to tee up some kind of bigger picture topics. And then we're going to come back around in future episodes and to really drill down on some of these things. Some of it, when we get more specific, will be a little more technical in nature. So, some of these are kind of easier to cover than others. So we wanted to at least cover the broad discussion, and then we'll have that opportunity to go back and actually, really drill down into specifics. So everyone, please stay tuned for that. But moving on, in light of kind of what you said, what you've seen in your experience, Jeff, just starting out big picture here, what would you say is the single greatest challenge specifically physicians in the medical practice realm are facing today? That can cover a lot of different things. So it doesn't have to be independent groups or employed groups or whatever, but just physicians in the medical practice world.
The way I would look at that is, and this may seem almost counterintuitive, but I think it'll make sense when you peel it back and look at it a little more granularly. I think one of the issues for systems, so in the 90s, we went through the whole acquisition stage and some pretty big beefy guaranteed contracts, and then hospitals got upside down in the employment model, and then they divested. And then in the 2000s, we decided again that we were going to learn from the past and move forward and start employing physicians again. And I think one of the problems inherent in the system process, if you will, is, you look at operational fissures or financial disparities or what have you. But I think one of the things that undergirds those bigger issues is a tenuous partnership between the doctors and the hospital leadership. And by that, I mean, and this happened in the 90s, and I think it continues to go on now, that physicians get acquired or they partner, and the system looks at them in many instances purely as employees versus, valuable cogs in the greater machinery of the system, if you will. I feel like if the docs don't have a seat at the table and they get minimized, they will eventually run into a lot of problems relative to finances and operations. And so when I look at a structure of an employed model, I think of it in terms of a pyramid where the base of the pyramid is going to be really your operational component. And to have a good sound foundation there is important so that when you start to acquire physicians, you've got some scalability, and hopefully you can plug and play with different physicians as you add them, as opposed to having a weak infrastructure, having the thing bend as you start to hammer additional resources onto a weak infrastructure. And so to really make that operational piece come to life, I think what you need to do is have a physician advisory committee that operates in some way, shape, or form with the C-suite so that the physicians have a seat at the table and can really have their concerns foisted upon leadership and hopefully taken into account. And that's not to say give them, the keys to the castle relative to finances and spending money, but having a say in how some things, or at least a little give-get in terms of how that conversation goes with regard to finances, investments, staffing, certainly quality of care and quality of care measures.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've said this. So obviously, a lot of my experience working with clients is on the transaction side, representing hospitals doing, whether it's a full-on acquisition and employment or joint venture with a physician group or ancillaries, something like that. And, I can tell you there is a very distinct line between, I think, the ones that have been most successful, those hospitals and those management teams that have been most successful are the ones that go into those relationships, go into those deals with the perspective that we are partnering with these guys. We are not acquiring them and going to merely make them employees in the traditional sense or the traditional kind of mindset that entails. And then, that they actually live that out, meaning they realize, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit more, but realize that hospitals have never been in the business of running medical practices. They don't understand ambulatory billing as well. They don't understand the rev cycle. They don't understand the contracts. And whether they admit it or not, hospitals are hospitals, and it's extremely obviously different than running a practice. And so the partnership model or partnership mindset, I think, is critical. And then something else you touched on there, what that translated to me is governance, right?
Right.
So that physician, the management committee is something that we always encourage, even if we're representing the hospital. It behooves them. It is going to be of value to our client to go that route and make sure there's an effective structure in place that facilitates that partnership mindset, as opposed to setting it up to fail or backtrack or anything like that. And governance is a good way to do that. And you don't have to overcomplicate governance.
Right.
But, having a basic committee in place that says, hey, not only do we are we saying we want to partner with you, but we're actually putting some structure in place that allows you to contribute to a committee and, help us make key decisions, full transparency as far as how compensation is calculated, things like that. And man, you cover a lot of issues when you just take a little relatively small step like that. So
totally agree. And I think interestingly, to your point about how these look like transactionally and making sure that both parties at the table understand what's going on. The one of the best projects that we had in terms of a turnaround involved a group, a system that was losing $400,000 per provider. When we got into the assessment, we found a lot of reasons why that was. It was a lot of foundational stuff that didn't get attended to. And it's sort of the old saw, or what you see with some frequency, is the system was in high octane mode to grow its provider count. Sure. Docs approached them and they said, hey, love to be part of the system. Didn't want to run my business anymore, what have you. And instead of having an overall strategy as to how the acquisition process should go, really this system started just mashing doctors onto an already weak infrastructure. And some of those deals ended up being, well, I love my staff. I need to take all my staff with me. Okay. I love my EMR. I need to take that. And then this is obviously the antithesis of any sort of scalability. And in the beginning, that may be manageable and doable. But as the thing grows, it creates havoc on the structure. And so what we did is we looked at these guys and the fact that there was no physician advisory committee, and we helped construct that. And interestingly enough, there were physicians hungry for change, but no voice at the table. So they really, what they did is they earmarked 3 or 4 docs who really wanted to participate, got them on board and started moving things forward. And the nice thing is, I think you alluded to this earlier, candidly, having a physician advisory committee not only gives the docs a seat at the table, but also mitigates a little bit of the C-suite pain. Yeah. So if you've got a hard decision and you've got your physician advisory committee on board to help make that decision, they can carry the message back to their cohorts. And certainly, as we all know, it's easier to get a message out doctor to doctor than it is CEO to doctor.
Absolutely.
So it goes both ways in that it gives the docs a seat at the table, but it also puts a little bit of impetus or change management on the physicians themselves, because they are there, and Absolutely. There will be expectations tied to that.
We have dovetailed into this conversation about alignment, quote unquote. Alignment can mean a lot of different things, whether you're talking clinical integration or, just hospital physician deals, however you want to look at it. But in terms of the current market landscape, specifically related to medical practices, in light of what we have seen with this most recent wave of consolidation, and I like you alluded to, the backstory here, where in the 90s, early 2000s, we saw that first wave of consolidation with a lot of physicians and hospitals. That didn't work out so well. The models, I would say, were inherently flawed to begin with. So it was no surprise to anyone, hardly, to see those dismantled or kind of broken down and dissolved. And with the latest round, which has actually been really going for a number of years now, but I would say it's taken a very different path and shown at least relatively much more success than the first wave. But in light of all the consolidation that has happened, whatever the structure is, employment, PSA, joint ventures, et cetera, what does the current landscape really look like, and how has it impacted the current medical practice? And that, even if you want to look at it in a couple different subgroups, so obviously you got independent groups, you got hospital owned or employed physician groups, and then specialty versus, surgical subspecialties versus primary care almost has taken somewhat of its own identity in this whole wave of consolidation. And all those to a certain extent overlap in what we're talking about with the broader perspective of alignment. But any thoughts there in terms of how the impact on medical practices, and then maybe specifically for some of those different types of constituents?
Yeah. So I think that, and I think I've got this right, there's an AMA study that came out, I believe, at the end of 2017 that suggested for the first time that they've been measuring, the number of physicians in private practice has fallen under 50%.
Yeah.
It's like 47% right now, something like that. I think that the independent groups are going to depending on size, obviously, and whether or not they're specialists. Like, for instance, you may not see a 12-doc ortho group necessarily running to a hospital for any sort of protection. But I think a lot of the independent groups are going to continue to struggle, mainly the smaller ones. Part of that is going to be the ever-present onward pressure or upward pressure of cost. They've got automatic increases built into the leases. You've got staff. If you've had staff for a long time, most of them are going to get and or expect some sort of raise. Certainly, we've thrown more IT costs onto physicians to meet all their meaningful use related things and things of that nature. And I think tangentially, you can make an argument that EMRs haven't necessarily improved the delivery of care. They've just given physicians in many instances a box to check off. So those kind of things are going to continue to be problematic. When you're talking about private practices, candidly, a lot of private practices don't know what their fee schedules look like or their allowables from their payers. Some of those are tied to Medicare, and if Medicare happens to cut, you'll take a cut to your commercial payer contract as well. And that's interestingly enough, it's if you were out making widgets somewhere, cars, trucks, whatever, what it cost you to deliver that product, and what you're going to get paid for that, or you hope to get paid on a retail level. We don't have that same experience on the healthcare delivery side of things.
A lot of hoping for the best.
Yeah. Swinging for the fence and hope you get a piece of one. So we struggle a little bit on the revenue side in terms of understanding, even volumes of our payer mix, how many Blue Cross Blue Shield patients we may have or how many Medicare patients we may have. And I don't think that's necessarily a dearth of skills per se. I think it's just time and effort. There are only so many things that, an administrator can do in their 6, 8, 10 doc practice on a daily basis. And sometimes those things fall by the wayside, even as important as they are. I think in terms of hospital-owned groups or employed models, I think healthcare is local. It just is what it is. And I was out west recently, and in the market that I had visited, the main system there was still in the acquisition mode. I had just acquired 100 docs and was still going to move down that way. And I think that's a little bit of the dynamic in that marketplace. They feel like that's what they need to do to move forward. I think getting back to this whole physician advisory, physician input thing, if the physicians have a seat at the table, these employed networks can work, but the physicians have to be invited. They have to be engaged and be partners to how the thing moves forward, generally speaking. But, I could see a time in the not too distant future where there's some more divestiture, another round as there was in the late 90s of hospitals shedding practices. I think that if physicians can get their acts together locally and form clinically integrated networks where they can do some negotiating and lever their size, I think that many systems don't necessarily want to employ docs. They want to keep a tight relationship with them, but they may not want to employ them. And so they may spin them off, and the docs may form their big integrated networks to lever contracts and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you allude to there that I think we need to make. And again, it kind of dovetails from the whole alignment or hospital physician transaction discussion, because especially a few years ago, the assumption was, if I'm a physician and I'm going to do something with the hospital, then you naturally mean employment, right? So that means I'm going full on to the other side, so to speak.
Yep.
And that can mean different things and can have certain kind of connotations or even baggage associated with that perspective. The reality is very different in that alignment means a lot of different things.
Right.
And that's kind of why I like to break it down, at least to a certain extent, in different kind of categories, because when you look at what's going on with, for instance, certain surgical specialties, there are groups that a few years ago would have said, you're crazy if you think we ever need to align. Gastro, GI is a good example where we've encountered multiple groups that said we don't need to sell. We don't need to be employed. That doesn't make sense. A hospital probably doesn't necessarily want to, need to, or have the money to, right? In terms of what the value would be. But there are other options, and we've seen, the PSA, the Professional Services Agreement, model work well, and particularly in specialties. And we've seen joint ventures on ancillaries work really well.
Mm-hmm.
So the hospital can buy in maybe to an endoscopy center or a surgery center or whatever, and still partner and have a little bit of the best of both worlds, if you will, and not necessarily have to sell out completely if the economics aren't there.
Yeah. I think people have looked at this as a binary choice generally. So be employed or go out on your own. And I think rather it's a continuum of things, right?
Yeah,
0 being, let's say, go out on your own, 100 being owned by the system. And you could be in a PSA, or you could be offering, services as a service line leader for a hospital system. So there are different ways and different levels of integration and alignment, if you will. And to your point, I think you have to figure out, first of all, you have to avail yourself of those choices and not think it's binary. But the next piece is figuring out what the economics look like for you to help you make the right choice and kind of let you have peace at night kind of thing.
The other interesting piece there too is looking at the market landscape. So, and you kind of alluded to this too, but we've worked in markets where they have done so many deals and they've been so progressive on the physician alignment efforts, meaning I'm speaking to a hospital here, that, the market, the hospitals in that market have gobbled up, to use, sorry, that's probably not the best term to use, but, have
affiliated.
That's right. With all the good groups, right? The top tier groups,
Mm-hmm.
the ones that haven't affiliated are the ones that want to and can afford to stay independent. And the ones that are left remaining, whatever, the jury may be out a little bit, but essentially the market has seen a significant degree of consolidation
Mm-hmm.
already. They have a different problem versus other markets. You kind of alluded to this. They're just getting on the physician alignment, physician partnership, not bandwagon, but that path where they're kind of working through their first deals, or they're building a platform of primary care and multi-specialty that, is starting kind of from the ground up. So it's definitely interesting to see that and see it, whether it's regionally or depending on kind of the dynamics of different markets. So we're by no means through the hospital physician deal, era here.
Right.
It's just, I think we're seeing kind of a next evolution of it. Maybe.
Agreed.
So you alluded to one of the things as it relates to independent groups is revenue cycle, but another one I want to touch on real quick, because I know you have a lot of experience in this area, is the EMR, or just overarching impact of technology and how that's played and kind of impacted some of these dynamics, both on the hospital side as well as the independent group side. Just talk to that, if you will, just what role technology play in regards to kind of what's happened and specifically some of the key challenges you alluded to.
Sure. I'll preface by saying I'm sort of a tech wonk in terms of I see the value in it. The overarching problem is we're putting these things on physicians' backs and telling them it's good for them. And in many instances, it's not. So, for instance, the first EMR I put in was a cardiology specific EMR for a cardiology group. And part of the reason that selection rose to the fore was because I knew my guys weren't going to take the time to build out the templates and all the other stuff that would be necessary for them to enjoy the efficiencies of the system. And so having a cardiology specific EMR required a lot less front end work by them. And that EMR, I think within 6 months, the physicians were fully back up to their normal pre-EMR schedule, seeing patients. And they got to the point where they were so efficient, they decided they would all take an extra half day off instead of taking a pay increase. So I guess the short version to that is, these things can go well. But like I said earlier, my sense is an EMR installation that goes 100% perfectly is really only about 80% there. I think part of the sales pitch on the technology side needs to be how you're going to help the physicians, how you're going to improve their lifestyle. I've got a presentation that I'm working on, and one of the survey results for this specialty was that the docs are stressed out primarily about, all these regs being foisted on them and all this technology being foisted on them. And the idea with the EMRs early on was that, hey, we're going to make your life easier and it's all going to be there in front of you. Well, now they have 85 things they have to click through and all that other stuff. And it really...
They're looking at the screen more than they're
absolutely true.
And
they don't interact with the patient. And, there are ways to use the technology. We, in fact, were able to, and this is early 2000s, take some clinical guidelines and build those in as decision-making tools into our EMR, which was both good from a quality of care perspective and frankly, from a revenue perspective. Mm-hmm. But it requires, I don't want to say steady hand, but it requires attention to that kind of stuff. And you can't just drop the thing and expect it to go well. We have a large academic med center that we did some work with, so over 2,000 physicians, and they took 3 years to put their EMR in. And what I heard from the physicians when we were on site was, I am done at 5 and I'm done with my notes at midnight. Mm-hmm. And then I'm back the next morning, do the same thing over again. So you've obviously added pain to their schedules. I think the technology is here and it's going to be here regardless. I think as the population ages, the telehealth piece is going to play a big role, especially as you do outreach into, rural clinics or further outside of the city limits, if you will. The technology piece with regard to reporting of MIPS data and that type of thing is here to stay. And I think, ultimately the technology aspect of it is good. But again, you can't just lump it on to the docs and expect them to, go make hay.
And there's no silver bullet.
There's no silver bullet.
I mean, you can't just say, all right, we done it. Check that off the list. Move on to the next item.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting because a lot of the tech companies, I happened to go to the HIMSS meeting about a month ago, so in March, and there were several companies who have solved the problem, whatever the problem is, and or no one else in the market is doing this. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's not. There are few of these things, and probably none of them. But I'm gonna go this way. That there's few of these things that are plug and play, and it just goes. Yeah. You don't drop it in, and it's off to the races. It requires effort. So I think too in the tech space, there are a lot of great applications out there, and maybe more great ones than not. And this is not to indict anybody. But there are some that are going to fall by the wayside. And the reality is there's a lot of noise out there. And I think people have to be really cognizant of what they're looking for and why they're looking for it, especially if you're starting to bolt on things outside of your standard portfolio services that your vendor offers.
Well, and I'm sure you've seen this where the more we get into clinical integration, that the buzzword here of interoperability becomes even more essential, because it's not just about one EMR system and, one rev cycle system, but how can we integrate that and not only make them talk, but continue to optimize, but also continue to kind of do the bare bones stuff. So, and I think it's interesting too, just like I said with, working on the hospital side, where the most successful hospital management teams have been those that their deals with physicians are truly partnerships. I think the same or similar concept goes to the EMR vendors, right? I think the most successful ones are the ones that realize that the fancy marketing promises and broad statements of kind of solving the problem is unrealistic in a variety of ways, or a multitude of ways. But at the end of the day, they can at least acknowledge they're not perfect, but they can at least do something to hit the key pain points.
Yeah.
So the example, I love that example about seeing patients until 5 and doing charts and working the system until midnight. That's an obvious pain point. Is that the problem? I don't know. Maybe for them, and maybe we can find a way to solve that. So I think there's legitimacy there, but it's also dangerous to kind of make blanket statements of, hey, we've solved the problem. We even know what the problem is, right?
Yep.
So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I also thought, I agree. The introduction of telehealth, now that we've been talking about telehealth for years, right? The technology, frankly, has been there to do a lot more things as far as whether it's remote monitoring or administration and things like that. And some specialties have been doing some form of telehealth. You think about radiology. I mean, they've been doing some form of telehealth in radiology for 10 years now, almost in some cases, to a certain degree. But I think now that we're able to see some reimbursement from specific codes related to productivity and reimbursement for what would be classified, I guess, as remote procedures, and just honing in on the impact of quality, not only quality of the care delivered, but the quality of the experience for the patient. And we hear story after story, how people can make it work for them, whether it's, access issues, rural health issues and things like that, or just basic keeping kids with sore throat out of the ER or
Yep.
even out of the urgent care, and the resources that are available there. So we see a lot of interesting things coming down that path. And it's not so much the technology that's revolutionary there. It's the process, the mindset, and the kind of effective implementation behind it.
Yeah. And you hit on a key point. I think the patient access piece, if one of the things and I know there are a lot of people out there approaching solving the quote unquote healthcare problem from the inside out. And what we as kind of practitioners on this side of things, and I would suggest systems and physicians, we kind of are blinders on sometimes. You look at this as the patient's, how are we addressing the patient's true needs?
Sure.
So access is huge. And candidly, the way insurance is now for patients, more and more of the cost being borne by the patient is out of pocket, right? And so they can vote with their feet. And if you can't get them in, or can't see them, or you treat them like they're wasting your time, they're going to vote with their feet.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And that's a reality that's either coming soon to a practice near you or is here now in many regards.
Yeah.
And I did want to touch on the health information exchange too.
Yeah, please.
So I remember when all of this was being bandied about in I think it was 06, 05, 06, 07. And it was going to be great because what we do is have all these computers talk. You have these disparate systems, and everyone would load their stuff up into wherever, the cloud somewhere, and some system would process it all and push it down to you. So whether you're using Cerner in one place and someone else has all scripts, you'd be able to see their notes and yada, yada. And that's laudable, certainly. But even in 2006, I could tell that wasn't something that was going to happen in a couple weeks. And and we're still, in a lot of instances, not there yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it goes without saying that I think the two overarching kind of conclusions I make in terms of where the health IT landscape is right now is the communications piece. We aren't there yet. And the data piece is so critical in terms of figuring out how to better leverage that.
Yeah. And there's a risk with the data piece.
Oh, yeah.
We've had the data forever, but in the private practice side, no one really paid attention to it for the most part. So they've got all this great data and they did nothing with it. And now we're mining more and more data across the spectrum. And I think my concern is you're going to get this data overload where you've got all this stuff you don't know what to do with it. Candidly.
I think many, even the hospitals are already dealing with that. And it's one of those things that trying to make sense of it is one thing, just trying to weed through the volumes is completely another thing. So that kind of ties into, I want to touch on, and we talked about this with Dr. Knight on our last episode, but I know you have some thoughts on this as well. But where we've gone, or kind of where we've come from, specifically on the medical practice physician side of the house, if you will, but what's happening as it relates to what we broadly call this volume to value shift, value-based care, value-based reimbursement. There's a lot there, obviously, in terms of what that really means. But we know, to however fast or slow, the system is evolving towards this idea where quality drives value and value drives returns. And that has to happen at kind of every layer, obviously, starting with the patient and the provider. But where does volume to value fit in? What does it mean for medical practices today?
So I think people, again, this just really depends on, I think, the leadership and the engagement in terms of the value argument. When you look at MIPS and the fact that, your reimbursement is going to be amended based 2 years post data. So 2017, you'll realize what happens to your Medicare finances in 2019. I think that some folks have embraced it, but candidly, when you look at a system that's really operationally upside down, I don't even know that MIPS is the first thing they're thinking about. When they're in readying to the tune of a $250,000, $300,000 a year subsidy per provider. I'm not sure they're focused on that. And then some who are, in some instances, they'll just take their data and submit it because they have an EMR that can grab the data and submit it. Well, the downside of that is if you've got certain elements that you're good at and some that you're bad at, you're going to end up net about middle, right? So if you've got 10 components, 5 you're really good at and 5 you're really bad at, you're going to end up with a 5 and you're going to get dinged financially for that. So I think some are backing into it. I think, again, it really depends on the leadership and how much they've embraced what can happen in the shift to value. And two, some places, I think, again, if you're proactive or looking to do carve-outs of their own value-based things, whether let's call it a, total knee or something like that, where they've been aggressive enough in their cost management and in their quality, their internal quality control, where they can package up a series of items into one bundle and go out and market that. I will tell you that when we tried, again, this goes back to my days running a practice, once we got our quality data, we were able to benchmark, and this is the early 2000s, I went to a large commercial payer and I said, hey, look at us relative to our peer groups. And they turned us away because they were not able to carve out at that point. But I think aggressive groups who are managing their cost and able to really monitor their care are going to be, even if they don't have carve-outs now, they'll be in better position when value-based stuff really starts to unfold. And the interesting thing is, I think people feel like this is the boy who cried wolf a little bit, right? They're not going to realize that it's here until
when they see it.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And honestly, everyone wants the magic bullet. They want to know precisely when the cutoff will come, right? Fee for service is done and we're now value based. Yep. Well, I would argue that fee for service, if it's going to go away, it's going to be a long time. And that may be I hate to put it in these terms, but maybe it's a steady erosion of fee for service reimbursement. But the value stuff is coming, and I feel like Medicare is driving that, and I feel like the commercial payers are getting on board.
I think that's right. In fact, I can't remember. We were talking recently, and we got to get people to understand that the idea of this overnight transition is just
you mean the hard and fast, like fee for service ends today and we're on our way to
that's right, because I don't think that would happen in any industry. It certainly isn't going to happen in the healthcare industry, where not only are we just slow to change and adopt, but in the process of changing, we have to go back and forth about a dozen times before we actually arrive somewhere. And so, but I think that's right. I think it is the boy who cried wolf, because again, what is it? Is this meaningful use? Is this, are we talking about capitation on steroids? You told us to do an ACO. Well, we just saw a news story last week where the participation in ACOs is rapidly dropping. It's tough. It's an understatement to say it's tough to keep up. To try to transition an organization is like driving a aircraft carrier on a Indy 500 course or something, and so or Formula One, I guess, would probably be the better comparison there. But the idea that value-based care is coming, I think we can at least embrace that, whatever conceptually that means, or whatever that ultimately ends up being. What are practices doing to participate or to prepare for participation? And is kind of a second component to that question. Is there a significant difference in terms of what, maybe larger groups are having to do versus your kind of traditional 1 to 5 doc practice?
Yeah, I think, again, if you're in a smaller, and I'm going to say smaller being 10 or less physicians, but if you're in a smaller practice, and the infrastructure is not built out where you have, if you're the administrator, kind of the titular head of the non-clinical area, if you're kind of the tip of the spear, I don't know that you're going to have a lot of time to dig into this and get it operationally ready unless your physicians are helping to drive that. And again, this was a physician advisory committee kind of thing that hopefully you have engaged shareholders who are interested in where this is going. And as we like to say, kind of they quote unquote get it. So they're plugged into what's going on. I recently did an assessment with a fair-sized employed model, and I kind of harken back to, how these things have been in many instances built, and they've been built kind of anti-scalable and with a ton of operational deficiencies, and now they're paying the price. And so one of the things we're trying to do with them is go in, not only help build a scalable operational model, but also build in some MIPS reporting structure and management of certain MIPS elements within their operations so that they're more efficient in the delivery, hopefully more cost effective, and reap the rewards. But we are starting to build those things into our fixer-upper work, if you will, the implementation work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so just kind of bring it a little bit full circle. Just give me your thoughts in terms of what's your outlook or how optimistic are you about the future of kind of the medical practice model, and, how you kind of anticipate that potentially going or changing or not changing over the next, few years, if you will.
Yeah, I think unless we can help the physicians out and lighten the load in some way, shape, or form, we're going to have less and less engaged docs who are really, they want to, they basically, all the docs I talk to, and this, they want to treat patients. That's what they want to do. Sure. That's why they got into this, not to screw around with an EMR or whatever else. Obviously, as the population ages, you're going to see more extenders deployed, which will be a double-edged sword because some physicians, some patients are still not on board with the idea of extenders. But that's going to be a necessary, I hate to say necessary evil because I know a lot of extenders, but I'm going to say that's a necessary choice to get access, to get patients in the door. I do think, as we alluded to earlier, I think that there is the prospect of better clinical integration if there's divestiture, or even if there's not. Getting the physicians to the table, talking to them, getting them engaged, whether they're employed or they're just building a mega group in, city X, but letting them drive a lot of what goes on, let them divine what the quality pieces look like, and hold each other's feet, the physicians' feet, to the fire. I'm optimistic relative to that. But we certainly need to make sure I don't mean Coker per se. We as people in the healthcare space need to get out of the way and let them do that. We need to enable them to move forward. And I think that's what we do at Coker is we play a big role with a lot of seasoned executives being able to bring to the table, tools and process to help them kind of take charge and ease their lives a little bit.
I agree. And the example of mid-levels or APPs or whatever you want to call them is a great one because, when we can move past the idea that someone is that no one is trying to argue that they're going to rephase physicians, right? That is not the point.
Adjunct.
The mid-levels don't want to do that, or they don't claim to do it. And the physicians institutional structure of the system wouldn't allow that to happen, right? So they're not going anywhere, they being physicians. And yet the mid-levels are a huge resource to play into this idea of optimization. And they can be, and they should be, a contributor to that as opposed to some ill-perceived threat or whatever to kind of the institutional legacy of the structure. And so I think as soon as we all, again, meaning we kind of as a system, as a community, industry, however you want to phrase it, can embrace those types of realities and accept them reasonably and fairly, then those are good steps.
Totally agree. And a perfect example, again, I'll go back to my days of running medical practices, and the specialty that I was in. We had 8 extenders at the time who, we hired new ones, obviously, and whatever the case may be, but we also had several who were there 4, 5, 6 years, and they became kind of specialists in that specialty, and the physicians gained trust in them. Obviously they overread everything that happens and sign off and mentor and monitor, but these, at the time it was PAs, ran their own clinics with physician oversight, and because they were so comfortable in the specialty. So, and I also think too, technology is going to play a bigger role. We talked about this a little bit, but one of the things I failed to broach, which I think is worth mentioning, is you don't know what the next thing is going to be. With AI and machine learning, you never know if that's going to play a role in more decision making. Maybe not at the bedside, but maybe there's algorithms that are going to be built based on 6, 8, 10, 48 inputs that come up with whatever the answer is. And so, I'm optimistic. Getting back to that question earlier, because this is always changing. That's what's great about healthcare from my perspective in terms of what we do, is it's never, ever static. It just isn't.
Yeah. So no, I think that's right. All right. So last thing I'd like to cover with a guest that's on, just maybe talk briefly, if you will, about kind of some of the things you do, but specifically kind of Coker does is this area of practice management and physician services, and even, some examples that we can maybe drill down on. And
Sure. So we, broadly speaking, we will go in and perform assessments on clinics, whether private practices or employed models. I think the smallest one that we've done is 3 or 4. It was a derm with Mohs. And the largest is the aforementioned academic med center of, over 2,000 physicians. We will do critical access hospitals. We've done a turnaround on a SNF on an Indian reservation. We do for-profit or not-for-profit. We a lot of this, and I hate to minimize what it is, but, it's sort of the 80-20 proposition that 80% of what we do, you can do anywhere. The other 20% is specialty specific or hospital specific, if you will, or geographic specific, what have you. So a lot of it is fairly static throughout in terms of what you're looking at. And what we do, again, generally is we look at the process start to finish. So we will go into a system and look at their clinics beginning at check-in, and we'll get as granular as looking at the scheduling and who's at the front desk and what the policies and procedures are relative to the front desk and the practice. We will follow the patient flow through the clinic space. We will deal with optimization of staff, kind of right staff member, right job. In other words, if you're an internal medicine practice, it probably doesn't make sense to have 10 RNs when you can have 10 MAs. But that becomes a physician preference proposition as well. But we do the scheduling piece and the staffing piece, and we do the rev cycle piece, and we will suggest to physicians how we can help optimize their productivity without getting into delivery of care, right? Mm-hmm. So we can, I hate to say lead a horse to water, but we can lead a horse to water, and if the docs aren't willing to drink, then that's entirely up to them. But what we can do is prep them to optimize patient throughput, that kind of thing. And we'll follow the patient out to check out and reschedule or scheduling their follow-up, et cetera. We'll do anything related to marketing of the practice and assistance with that. And candidly, we do, I think, a fairly good job of delivering quantifiable ROIs. So we'll go in and we'll find maybe some financial shortcomings, and we will work with the client using their data. So it's not us saying, hey, this is what we have and let's go by this. And we'll build out an argument for them as to what the ROI looks like. And a great example is a client we had out west who did a large amount of fee-for-service billing, and they had a pretty good-sized CBO. And the CBO was in pretty grave disrepair. We went in and did a 2-month an assessment rather, which was on site for about a week, and then the reporting and all took about 6 weeks to 2 months. After that, where we quantified the issues we saw and presented those, the COO of that market asked us to come in and help rebuild the whole thing. So we went in, deployed a team, and we were engaged for 7 months. And so when that project ended, we went back through and reviewed their data 6 months post-implementation, and had found out using their numbers that they got a 14-to-1 return on that engagement. And needless to say, they looked at us on an ongoing basis to do other projects because they were happy with the quality. They got what they wanted. And, candidly, we're honest brokers. When we get in there, we'll tell them what's going on. They can elect to use us or not use us after an assessment. We don't oversell. we were talking about this with EMR, and I thought it was sort of poignant, is that you want to undersell and overdeliver, sure, right? Don't promise the moon and the stars if you're just going to go out and cut the lawn. So, in any event, that's kind of the broad look at what we do. And we also get asked to do some one-offs. So we've been asked to just do patient access. Well, patient access isn't just open the door and let them in. It has to do with staffing volumes of physicians and the ancillary staff that goes into that situation. We've been asked to do just a rev cycle review. Well, again, that has to do with scheduling and your billing and your receivables and denials, which can oftentimes be a clinic front-end component. So kind of soup to nuts. And we do a lot of interim work, which interestingly enough, keeps us fairly busy.
Yeah.
Where we'll put someone into a usually an executive director or high level administrator role for a big practice or an employed model, and they will kind of fill the void while a system recruits.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is interesting. I'll kind of toot your horn here for you for a minute, but there rarely is a case where you're going to go in and they're not going to walk away with some degree of value delivered. And it seems like kind of an obvious thing. Well, yeah, you always got to deliver value. Unfortunately, some of the things we end up doing as a consulting firm is, telling our client, this isn't the best route for you. And maybe you got to go a different direction or something. There's value there, but it's kind of, it's a little bit of bittersweet. In this case, I've seen you guys go in and you'll have a tool that you're able to kind of show them. Here's essentially a red light, green light type perspective of, okay, these are the areas we need to drill down on. These things need to be addressed today. These things, okay, they need to be addressed, but, maybe we can look at more of, 3 to 6 month horizon or whatever that may be. And I think that's critical because, that to me, that's a very realistic way of going in and looking at something like this, because as you said, our role here is a third party. We don't necessarily have a horse in this race other than we want everybody to succeed and for value to be created for our client. And so that is critical that they get the real story and doing that. But that can get convoluted real easy, particularly when you got a lot of different people and stakeholders involved. Right. And then the other thing I've noticed is when you guys come in, again, kind of going back to our discussion on integration and alignment, but that integration piece, what do you do after the deal is done? What do you do after, you've built up this network, whether it's an employed network or you have employed and PSAs and other joint ventures, and you're trying to optimize, right? And there, again, it's not an overnight solution. Right. And I think, even if they kind of understand that, when you start putting numbers to it, like you said, quantifiable ROI, that tells a different story for a hospital CFO. Yeah.
And I think the part of that too is not telling them what you think they should do, but understanding what they think they should do and then coming to an agreement. So a perfect example is one rebuild we did where it was just real simple operational stuff, clinic hours and patient volumes and things of that nature. And so baselining those so we have a deliverable over the course of whatever the thing is. So for instance, let's say it's 6 months. We knew that one of the goals of this system was to increase patient throughput and volumes. And so what we did is we needed to create a mechanism to get better access into the clinics, which is multivariate. We won't get into it here, but so the baseline is, okay, 10 patients a day as of January 1st. Well, as of February 1st, we're up to 15 patients a day. And as of March 1st, we're up to 20 patients. And that type of thing, you can definitely put a dollar value onto that. And it's not all about dollars necessarily either, but it also does prove out that, the investment in us is worthwhile and makes sense. And you are helping your bottom line.
Well, if the operations and infrastructure supports it, then that value is legitimate, and it's kind of a win-win,
absolutely.
So no, I like that. All right, great. Well, I think we've covered a number of different broad topics here. I do want to kind of bring it to a close, but as we do that, as I mentioned earlier, the idea here today was to really tee up a lot of our kind of general topics and kind of what we do in this area. But we are going to drill down on something, and I'm really looking forward to some of these follow-up discussions. So I want everyone to kind of stay tuned for additional content coming out on these. And I know some of the things we were going to talk about, optimization of rev cycle or its turnaround or systems, and more discussion on general operation, and then kind of the different components of the practice ecosystem and what that looks like, and what administrators need to know, what physician leaders need to know, what hospitals need to know as it relates to their networks. And then I also want to circle back on the value-based reimbursement discussion because, again, as we said, I think we can all at least agree conceptually that we're moving in that direction. Right. How that pans out, whatever, that remains to be seen. And there's still some time for that. In the meantime, I think we really want to make sure our clients are out there, when we're working with them out there, that they're at least doing what they need to do and what they can do today to optimize for as we move in that direction.
Yep.
It's not going to be a one-day changeover type scenario where
pull the lever.
Switch. Yeah, exactly. No switch is getting flipped, but gradually we're moving there. You don't want to get left behind.
Yep.
And so there's a lot we can talk about there. I do want to plug real quick Coker in terms of where you can find us and follow us. The first place is the easiest place is probably our website, cokergroup.com. And you can reach out to us directly there via the contact page, or there's an email. You can email us specific things related to the podcast or anything where you hear from us. Feedback@cokergroup.com is the email address there. Also on Twitter, at Coker Group, at COKER Group on Twitter. And then you can also follow us, some of our people on Twitter as well, specifically where we put out a lot of content. LinkedIn as well. You can go to LinkedIn, search for Coker Group, and you'll find our page there and some of our people, and all of our content is usually found there as well. So multiple places you can find us, but please reach out to us. We really want to encourage people to provide feedback. We love hearing feedback. We want to hear, any sort of feedback, positive, negative, or otherwise, I guess, in terms of anything you hear on the Coffee with Coker podcast or anything else Coker puts out there. Please give us that feedback. Also, we want to welcome your participation. So if you have questions, or if there's a topic or subject matter that you want us to cover, let us know, and we absolutely will cover it. And we want to make sure we're keeping a kind of a bank of questions or suggestions or requested topics so that we make sure all those things get covered. And so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, definitely reach out to us, find us on any of those, our website or social media, and we'd love to get that feedback and any questions or recommendations there. So otherwise, Jeff, thanks for the discussion today. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.